Matilda Redmond stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1878, with $43 sewn into the hem of her skirt, a leather traveling case that had seen better decades, and a name she had every intention of burying somewhere between Missouri and the rest of her life. The wind off the prairie hit her the moment her boot touched the packed dirt of the main street, and it was nothing like the genteel breezes she had known in St. Louis. This wind had teeth. It carried red dust and the smell of cattle and something wild and untamed that she had no proper word for, and it struck her square in the chest like a fist wrapped in the future. She stood there blinking into it, one hand pressed to the brim of her bonnet, and she thought, well, here it is then, the rest of my life. She had not come west on a whim. Women who came west on whims did not last, and Matilda Redmond, whatever else she was, intended to last. She had come west carrying a plan which was modest in its ambitions but fierce in its necessity. She would find work. She would find a different name, one that belonged to nobody who knew her, nobody who had looked at her with pity or contempt or the particular cruelty of memory. She would become someone else entirely. The name Redmond had been given to her by a man who was now 3 years cold in a St. Louis churchyard, and she had carried it long enough out of obligation and habit. But obligation wore thin eventually, and habit could be broken like a dry stick across your knee. She had chosen Caldwell because it was at the edge of what civilized people called civilization, and because the cattle trade had made it busy enough that a lone woman arriving unannounced would not draw the kind of attention that smaller towns generated like heat. Caldwell sat just north of the Kansas Indian Territory line, a place where the long cattle drives up from Texas ended, and the business of the frontier conducted itself loudly and without apology. It was rough. She had expected rough. Rough she could manage. What she had not expected was the man who nearly knocked her traveling case straight into the mud of the street. He was tall in the way that men raised on hard work and open land tend to be tall, which is to say not merely in height but in the overall impression of him, the width of his shoulders inside a worn canvas coat, the length of his stride, the way he seemed to occupy more than his fair share of the available air. He caught her case before it hit the ground, which was the one grace note in the collision, and he straightened up and looked at her with eyes that were somewhere between brown and gold and impossible to categorize quickly. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said, and he meant it. She could tell because there was no deflection in his voice, no performance of apology while actually blaming her for being in his path. He simply looked at her squarely and said it like a man who had been raised to mean what he said and say what he meant. "You nearly lost my case," she said, taking it from him with both hands. "I know it. I apologize." He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "You just arrived." "I did, seeking work or family." She looked at him for a moment. He asked it plainly, without the particular quality of nosiness that small places bred into people. It was a practical question out here, where strangers arrived with one of 2 purposes. "Work," she said. He nodded as though that were a perfectly reasonable thing. "Mrs. Calloway takes on boarders and she sometimes needs help in the kitchen. 2nd Street to the left, white shutters, big elm out front. You tell her Abraham Hawkins sent you, and she will not overcharge you on the room." And then he walked on down the street, as though he had simply delivered necessary information to someone who needed it, which was exactly what he had done. Matilda stood in the middle of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, holding her traveling case and watching him go, and she thought that she did not know anything about Abraham Hawkins except his name, and the fact that his eyes were an uncommonly interesting color. But he had caught her case before it hit the mud, and he had given her useful information without attaching any price to it, and in her experience that was rarer than gold dust. She found Mrs. Calloway's boarding house exactly where he had said it would be. Mrs. Calloway was a woman of about 55 with iron-gray hair, arms built for serious labor, and the kind of practical intelligence that expressed itself not in cleverness but in competence. She looked Matilda over the way a person looks at a horse they are considering purchasing, not unkindly but with clear assessment, and she said, "Abraham sent you." "He did." "Then you are likely not trouble," Mrs. Calloway said, and showed her to a room on the second floor that was small but clean and had a window that faced west, which meant she could watch the sunsets that Matilda would later understand were among the finest things the Kansas prairie had to offer. She paid for 2 weeks with money from her hem. She ate supper at Mrs. Calloway's long table with 4 other boarders, 2 cattle buyers from Wichita who were loud and harmless, a quiet schoolteacher named Eleanor Marsh who had come from Ohio, and a land surveyor who spoke very little but ate a remarkable quantity of bread. Nobody asked Matilda her name. Nobody in Caldwell asked anybody anything until they had been there long enough to prove themselves worthy of the inquiry. She started work in Mrs. Calloway's kitchen the next morning. She was a capable cook, having learned out of necessity rather than choice, and Mrs. Calloway was not a woman who wasted capable people. Within a week, Matilda was helping to serve the meals, keep the books for the boarding house, and manage the supply ordering, which involved trips to Caldwell's general store every Tuesday and Friday. It was on the second Friday that she saw Abraham Hawkins again. He was at the store's counter talking to the proprietor, a thick-necked man named Garrett Hutchins, about the purchase of fencing wire. Matilda was at the far end of the counter working through her supply list, and she noticed him before he noticed her, which gave her a moment to observe him without the self-consciousness of being observed in return. He was arguing about the price of the wire, but he was arguing the way she had seen very few men argue, which was calmly and with specific numbers, not with bluster or volume. He had clearly done his research, and he presented it without drama, and Garrett Hutchins ultimately agreed to the lower price with the expression of a man who knew when he had met his match. "Miss Redmond," Abraham said when he turned and saw her, and she was briefly startled that he remembered her name, and then she remembered that she had told him nothing of the kind. "We were not properly introduced," she said. "I did not tell you my name." "No," he agreed, "but Mrs. Calloway mentioned it when I stopped by to ask after you." He said this without embarrassment, as though checking on a stranger's welfare was a normal and unremarkable thing. "She said you were settling in well. You checked on me. I nearly knocked you into the street your first morning here. It seemed only proper." She found she did not have an immediate answer for that, which was unusual. She was not typically a woman who ran short on words. "Well," she said finally, "I am settling in well." "Thank you, good." He picked up the roll of fencing wire that Garrett Hutchins had pushed across the counter. "How do you find Caldwell?" "Loud," she said honestly, "and dusty. And nothing at all like I expected." He smiled then, for the first time she had seen, and it changed his face considerably. It was a slow smile, the kind that started at the corners and worked its way inward, and it suggested that he found the world genuinely amusing on occasion rather than performing amusement for the benefit of onlookers. "That is the most accurate description of this town I have ever heard," he said. They were briefly silent in the easy way of two people who are not uncomfortable with silence, which was its own kind of rarity. "I have a ranch about 6 miles north," he said then. "Small operation. I run cattle and I am attempting to grow wheat, which is either going to be the most sensible thing I have done in years or a catastrophic waste of time, and I will not know which for another season at least." He said it straightforwardly, neither boasting nor complaining. "The fencing is for the wheat fields. I need to keep the cattle out of them." "That sounds like a great deal of work for one person," she said. "I have one hired hand. A boy named Charlie Briggs, 17 years old and possessed of more enthusiasm than sense, but he learns quickly. He hefted the wire. I should get this back. Good day, Miss Redmond. Good day, Mr. Hawkins." He walked out of the store, and Matilda turned back to her supply list and found that she had lost her place entirely, which irritated her because she was not the kind of woman who lost her place. The weeks settled into rhythm. She was good at the work of the boarding house, genuinely good at it, and Mrs. Calloway began to pay her a small wage in addition to her room and board. Eleanor Marsh, the schoolteacher, became something approaching a friend, and the two women sometimes took evening walks along the quieter streets of Caldwell when the cattle trade had settled for the night, and the town had reduced itself to something more livable. It was Eleanor who asked, one mild evening in late May, what had brought Matilda west from St. Louis. Matilda was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of barn swallows dip and wheel over the rooftops. "Change," she said finally. "I wanted a different kind of life than the one I had." "Did something happen?" Eleanor asked, not pryingly but with the particular care of a woman who understood that some questions needed to be asked gently or not at all. "My husband died," Matilda said. 3 years ago. He was not a cruel man, but he was not a good one either, and after he was gone, I realized that I had spent 6 years being someone I had not chosen to be. I thought the West might be a place where a person could do some choosing. Eleanor nodded. "And can it?" "I think so," Matilda said slowly. "I think it might be." What she did not say, not yet, not even to Eleanor, who was kind and discreet, was that she had come west with the firm intention of changing her name. Redmond had been her husband's name. Before that she had been Matilda Carroll, which was her father's name, and her father had been neither cruel nor good in much the same way the husband had been. She had thought that arriving in a new place, she would simply introduce herself as something else entirely. She had considered names: Frances Alcott, Catherine Moore. Something plain and clean and belonging to no one. But she had arrived in Caldwell as Matilda Redmond, because that was the name on the documents she carried, and somehow the name had traveled with her into every introduction before she could stop it, and now Mrs. Calloway knew it, and Eleanor knew it, and Abraham Hawkins knew it, and Garrett Hutchins at the general store knew it, and it had become, once again without her choosing, the name she was. She was thinking about this on a warm Saturday afternoon in June when Abraham Hawkins appeared at the door of Mrs. Calloway's kitchen, hat in hand, and asked whether she might be available to ride out to his property. She looked at him steadily. "For what purpose?" "I have a problem with my accounts," he said, "and Mrs. Calloway tells me you have a talent for figures. I have also found myself in need of advice from someone who does not have a financial stake in the outcome." He paused. "I will pay for your time, naturally." She dried her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Calloway," she called, "I need an hour or two." Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had seen this particular situation before, and found it moderately entertaining. "Take the afternoon," she said, with an equanimity that suggested she had decided something about Abraham Hawkins and Matilda Redmond that neither of them had decided about themselves yet. They rode north on horses borrowed from the livery, which was to say Abraham rode his own horse, a rangy gray gelding with excellent manners, and Matilda rode a stocky mare that Mrs. Calloway occasionally used for errands. The land opened up as they left Caldwell, rolling out in great flat swells of grass that caught the wind and moved like the surface of a slow river, and the sky above it was the kind of blue that people in cities do not see, because cities are not big enough to contain it properly. "It is beautiful," Matilda said, almost to herself. "It is," Abraham agreed without the self-consciousness of a man who has heard someone notice the place he loves. He said it simply, the way you agree with something that is plainly true. The ranch was modest but well kept, which told her a great deal about him. The house was small and square, built of cedar that had weathered to a silvery gray. There was a barn in better condition than the house, which was also telling. The wheat fields lay to the east of the house behind new fencing, the young green plants standing in precise rows that stretched away into the distance. A boy of perhaps 17 with a face full of freckles and an impressive amount of dust on his clothing was repairing a section of fence at the far edge of the field, and he raised a hand in greeting as they rode in. "That is Charlie Briggs," Abraham said. "He appears to be entirely made of dust," Matilda observed. "He does," Abraham agreed. "He is always like that. I think it is constitutional." They sat at Abraham's kitchen table with the account ledger spread between them, and Matilda found the problem within 20 minutes. He had been double recording a supply expense from the previous fall, which had thrown his profit calculations badly off. The ranch was actually in better financial shape than he thought. "You are not in trouble," she told him, turning the ledger so he could see the column she was pointing to. "You have been recording the same purchase twice, here and here. Remove one of these entries and your balance corrects itself." He leaned forward over the ledger, close enough that she was briefly aware of the scent of cedar and clean cotton, and the particular outdoor smell of a man who spent his days in the weather, and he studied the columns she indicated with the careful attention of someone who was not ashamed to spend time understanding something before responding to it. "You are right," he said. "I have been losing sleep over numbers that were wrong from the beginning. Many people make this error," she said. "There is no shame in it." He sat back and looked at her directly, the way he seemed to do everything, without the social deflections that most people used as a matter of habit. "How did you learn figures?" "My father kept a hardware business," she said. "I kept his books from the time I was 12 because he found the work tedious and I did not. I kept my husband's books in St. Louis for the same reason." She paused. "I am better at numbers than I am at most things." "I doubt that very much," he said quietly, and she looked up at him, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not flirtatious exactly but was something more serious than mere politeness, an expression of genuine assessment, the kind that sees rather than simply looks. She folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Hawkins, can I ask you something direct? I wish you would. Why did you check on me at Mrs. Calloway's the week after I arrived, truly?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, but the quiet of a man who considers his words before he releases them. "I knocked you halfway across the street on your first morning in a town you did not know," he said. "And you were alone, and something in the way you stood there after, holding your case and looking at the street, told me that you were a person who would not ask for help even if she needed it." He met her eyes. "I thought somebody ought to at least check." Matilda Redmond, who had not cried since the winter her husband died and she had sat alone in their dark house in St. Louis deciding what to do next, felt something shift behind her ribs at those words. She did not cry now either. But something moved in her, something slow and cautious, like a thing that has been still for a long time and is not sure yet whether it is safe to move. "That was kind of you," she said. "It was practical," he corrected gently, and she understood that for Abraham Hawkins, practical and kind were the same category of thing. Charlie Briggs knocked on the open kitchen door then to ask about the fence repair, and the moment, whatever it had been, was gently interrupted, and Matilda gathered the ledger pages back into their proper order and prepared to be returned to Caldwell. But on the ride back, with the afternoon light going gold and long across the prairie, Abraham told her about the ranch, how he had bought it 4 years ago with money saved from 8 years working cattle drives up from Texas, how he had ridden the Kishom Trail 3 times and the Western Trail once, and had decided after the 4th drive that he wanted land of his own, and a life that was not conducted entirely on horseback with everything he owned in a saddlebag. She listened, and she asked questions that were specific and interested rather than politely general, and he seemed to appreciate the distinction. "And you?" he asked as Caldwell came back into view against the evening sky. "What do you want from Caldwell, from the West?" She had not answered that question honestly for anyone yet. She had said change, which was true but incomplete. She looked at the town ahead of them, the pale smudge of it in the golden light, and she said, "I came out here meaning to start over entirely. New place, new name, new everything." "New name," he said, not as a question. "Redmond was my husband's name," she said. "I thought out here I might become someone else, Francis someone. Catherine something." She paused. "But I arrived and I told everyone Redmond before I could think to tell them anything else, and now it is what I am called again." He rode in silence for a moment. The gray gelding's hooves were quiet on the soft dirt of the trail. "Why Francis or Catherine?" he asked. "Those do not seem like you." She glanced at him. You have known me 3 weeks. I know, he said, but Matilda suits you. It is a name that has some weight to it, some history. It is not a name that tries to be something small. He paused. Redmond I cannot speak to, but Matilda seems right. She did not say anything for a long moment. Matilda Redmond suits you, he said again quietly, as though it were simply an observation about the color of the sky. She thought about Frances. She thought about Catherine. She thought about the particular freedom she had imagined in a new name, the clean slate of it, the erasure. And she thought about Abraham Hawkins saying Matilda suits you with the same frank conviction he brought to everything he said. And she thought that perhaps the name was not the thing she had needed to change after all. That is a very strong opinion for someone who has known me 3 weeks, she said finally, but there was no real edge in it. It is, he agreed pleasantly, and touched his hat as they reached the front door of Mrs. Calloway's boarding house. She kept the name. She did not make a formal decision about it. She simply found, in the days following, that she no longer thought about changing it, and that was decision enough. July in Caldwell was loud and hot and full of cattle. The Kishom Trail ended in Caldwell, which meant that through the summer months the town was thick with trail-weary cowboys who had ridden north from Texas with herds that numbered in the thousands, and the business of the town organized itself around their arrival and their money. Mrs. Calloway's boarding house was full to capacity, and Matilda worked from before sunup to well after sundown, cooking and serving and keeping the accounts with the systematic efficiency that had become her chief professional virtue. Abraham came to supper at the boarding house twice a week, which Mrs. Calloway had announced was his general practice long before Matilda had arrived, and so there was nothing particularly pointed about it. He sat at the long table with whatever boarders and passing travelers were there, and he spoke to everyone with the same direct, unhurried quality, and he helped clear the dishes after, which earned him Mrs. Calloway's permanent high regard and made Garrett Hutchins's wife, who had heard about it, express an opinion that he was either exceptionally well raised or he wanted something, and she was not sure which. He wanted nothing that he did not say plainly. He began asking Matilda whether she wanted to ride on Sunday afternoons, when the boarding house was quiet and Mrs. Calloway rested, and she began saying yes. They rode out across the prairie, and she learned the land the way you learn a new language, by immersion and by making mistakes, and by gradually finding that certain words come naturally. He taught her which plants were edible and which were not, and how to read the sky for weather, and the names of the grasses, buffalo grass and bluestem and switchgrass, which turned the prairie into different colors as the season moved. She told him about St. Louis, not all of it, but the parts that she could look at without flinching, the river and the markets and the way the city smelled in the rain. She told him about keeping accounts and about the hardware store and about the years of her marriage, which had been neither violent nor warm, merely occupying, the way some years are simply something you survive rather than live. He listened without offering judgments or solutions, which was rare in a man. Most men who heard about difficulty had an immediate impulse to fix it, to suggest, to redirect. Abraham listened the way the prairie absorbed rain, taking it in completely, letting it settle. "Were you ever married?" she asked once, on a hot Sunday afternoon in late July when they had stopped to let the horses rest by a shallow creek that cut through the grass. "No," he said. He was sitting on a flat rock with his hat resting on his knee, and he was looking at the water which ran clear and slow over pale stones. "I was engaged once, a long time ago before the cattle drives, a woman in Missouri. But she was sensible and she did not want to wait 3 years for a man who was going to come back with trail dust and not much else, and she married a banker instead." He said it without bitterness. She was right to do it. She knew what she wanted and she went and got it. "I have always admired that about her, even now." Matilda looked at him. "You admire the woman who did not wait for you. She knew her own mind," he said simply. "That is worth admiring in anyone." She thought about knowing her own mind. She thought about the woman she had been in St. Louis, who had not known her own mind at all, who had gone along with things because going along was what the life she was living seemed to require. She thought about stepping off the stagecoach in Caldwell with $43 and a name she meant to change and no particular plan beyond forward. "I am learning to know mine," she said. He turned and looked at her with those brown gold eyes that she had catalogued by now and still could not categorize precisely. "I know," he said. "I can see it happening." There was a moment then, sitting by that slow creek in the July heat with the grasshoppers leaping in the bluestem around them, where she thought he might say something more, or she might, and the air between them had the particular quality of a held breath. But neither of them said anything more, and the horses moved in the shallows and the grasshoppers kept leaping, and the moment folded itself up and passed, and she was glad it had and also aware that she was not entirely glad, which was a confusing combination of feelings that she preferred not to examine too carefully. August brought trouble, though not the kind she had expected. A man arrived in Caldwell on a Friday, which was the market day when the town was at its busiest, and he was asking questions about her. She found out about it from a leaner, who had heard it from Garrett Hutchins's wife, who had heard it from two of the Texas cowboys at the saloon. The man had been describing a woman, medium height, dark-haired, gray eyes, from St. Louis, and asking whether anyone had seen her. Matilda listened to this with a very still face and a heart that had gone cold and fast in her chest. She had not entirely anticipated this possibility, but she had not entirely failed to anticipate it either. Her husband's brother, a man named Clement Redmond, had contested the will after the husband's death, claiming that certain of the household properties and a small piece of land her husband had left her were rightfully family assets. The legal matter had been inconclusive and slow, and Matilda had grown tired of waiting for its resolution and had come west before it was finished. She had not hidden exactly. She had simply relocated. Clement Redmond was a man with the persistence of a bloodhound and the warmth of a February doorknob, and she had suspected he would not simply accept her absence. She went directly to Abraham. She had not planned to go directly to Abraham. She had planned to think it through carefully and decide on a course of action and perhaps consult a leaner. But she found herself walking north along the main street toward the livery where she knew he was having his horse shod on Friday afternoons, and when she found him there, leaning against the wall watching the farrier work, she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to tell me honestly what you think I should do." He straightened up and looked at her face and said, "All right. Let us go somewhere quieter." They walked to the far end of the livery, where the noise of the street was reduced to a general murmur, and she told him about Clement Redmond and the contested will, and the land and her departure from St. Louis. She told him all of it, including the parts that made her look like someone who had run rather than someone who had bravely relocated, because Abraham was not a man she wanted to impress with a partial truth. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What does the will say exactly?" "It gives me the house and the furniture and the piece of land in Missouri, which is about 40 acres along a creek. Clement says the land was always meant to be family property and that Robert, my husband, did not have the right to give it to me independently." "And what does the law say?" "The law had not decided when I left." Abraham nodded slowly. "Do you have documentation of the will?" "I have a copy, yes." "Then you are not without standing," he said. "Clement Redmond coming out here to find you does not change the legal situation. He is not the law. He cannot compel you to do anything by simply appearing in a Kansas cattle town and asking questions." "He is not a violent man," she said, "but he is persistent and unpleasant, and I do not particularly wish to spend my days in Kansas looking over my shoulder for him." "No," Abraham agreed. "You should not have to do that." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There is a solicitor in Wichita who handles property law. I know him. His name is Fowler, and he is good. If you wrote to him with the copy of the will and the details of the dispute, He could advise you on what standing you actually have and whether Clement has any real legal claim. That costs money, she said. It does, he said, and if you are short of it right now, that is a problem I can solve temporarily if you will allow me to. She looked at him. That is a great deal to offer someone you have known 2 months. It is, he said, without backing away from it. She felt something move in her again, that slow, cautious thing that had moved before. And this time it moved a little further than it had the last time, a little more sure of its footing. I will accept the offer, she said, because she was learning to know her own mind, and her own mind said that pride was a luxury she could not afford, and that Abraham Hawkins was a man who could be trusted with the practical things and perhaps, eventually, with other things as well. Clement Redmond arrived at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house the following Tuesday morning. He was a compact man of about 50, with the look of someone who considered charm unnecessary and perseverance sufficient, and he came to the front door and asked for Matilda Redmond in the tone of a man who expected to be given what he asked for. Mrs. Calloway, who had been apprised of the situation by Matilda, told him that no one by that name was in residence, and that he was welcome to take his business to the hotel if he needed accommodation. She did this with the placid authority of a woman who had been managing difficult people for 3 decades, and she closed the door before he could formulate a second approach. Matilda watched this from the top of the stairs with her heart hammering and her chin up, and she thought about how much she had come to value Mrs. Calloway's particular brand of unflappable competence. Clement was not so easily deterred. He stayed in Caldwell for 4 days, asking questions in the general store and at the hotel and along the main street, and the town gave him very little because Caldwell protected its own, not out of sentimentality, but out of the frontier's particular ethic, which was that a town's business was its own business and outsiders were welcome only as far as they were useful. A man from Missouri asking pointed questions about a woman who worked at the boarding house did not qualify as useful. On the 3rd day, Abraham went to find him. Matilda found out about this afterward, from Charlie Briggs of all people, who had come to town for supplies and witnessed the conversation in the street. Abraham had apparently walked directly up to Clement Redmond, introduced himself by name, and said clearly and without hostility that Miss Redmond's legal affairs were in the hands of a solicitor in Wichita, that any correspondence regarding the disputed property should be directed to that solicitor, and that Miss Redmond was a resident of Caldwell who was known and valued by her community, and that Clement's presence in town was creating a situation that the town's residents found unwelcome. Clement had apparently said something that Charlie could not fully hear, and that had made Abraham's expression go very flat. Abraham had then said, still without raising his voice, that Caldwell was a town that took the well-being of its people seriously, and that he personally would be happy to accompany Clement to the stage depot to ensure he had his ticket for the return journey. Clement Redmond was on the Thursday stage back east. When Matilda found out, she went to the ranch in the late afternoon and found Abraham in the wheat field, which was coming in slowly but promisingly, examining the plants with the careful attention of a man who has invested a great deal and is trying not to show how anxious he is about it. She walked out to him through the green rows, and he straightened up when he heard her coming, and he knew from her face that she had heard. "You should have told me you were going to do that," she said. "You would have told me not to," he said. "Yes," she said, "I would have." She stood in the wheat field in the late afternoon light with the warm wind moving through the green rows around them, and she looked at him steadily. "Thank you. He had no right to come out here and harass you," Abraham said, simply and firmly. "The law is one thing, that was something different, Abraham." She used his given name for the first time and felt the change of it, the way a key feels different once you have used it to open the door it was made for. "I'm not accustomed to people doing things like that for me." He looked at her for a moment with that direct, serious gaze. "I know," he said quietly. "I would like you to get accustomed to it if you are willing." The prairie wind moved through the wheat around them. Somewhere near the barn, Charlie Briggs was singing to himself badly, with great confidence. The sky overhead was the enormous Kansas sky, all that blue with the gold of late afternoon eating at its edges. "Are you saying something specific?" she asked, because she was learning to be the kind of person who asked direct questions. "I am," he said. He turned his hat in his hands, the only outward sign of any nervousness, and said, "I have been thinking about you since the morning you arrived, Matilda. I have been thinking about you with a seriousness that I do not think I have felt about anything since I decided to buy this land. I am not a man with a great deal to offer in terms of ease or luxury. I have this farm and I have my word, and I have the honest intention of making something of both of them. But if you wanted to be here with me, I would consider that the best thing that has happened to me since I planted this wheat." She was quiet for a long moment, not because she was uncertain, she realized, but because the certainty was large enough that it took a moment to find its proper shape in her chest. "You said my name suits me," she said. "It does. You said Matilda Redmond suits me. It does. I came out here meaning to change everything about myself," she said. "The place, the name, the whole shape of my life. And I have changed some of it and kept some of it, and I am not sure yet which changes were the ones that mattered." She looked at him. "But I think you might be one of the things worth keeping, and I think I would like to find out." He did not move immediately, which was characteristic of him, the careful, unhurried quality of a man who does not make small gestures of large things. When he did move, he reached out and took her hand in both of his, the way you hold something you intend to keep safe, and he said, "Then we will find out together." Charlie Briggs chose exactly this moment to appear around the corner of the barn, see them, and fall over a feed bucket he had left in the middle of the path, making a considerable racket and producing language that was not suitable for any occasion. Abraham and Matilda both turned at the noise and then looked at each other, and they both started laughing at the same time, the real kind of laughing that comes from somewhere genuine, and Charlie Briggs righted himself and said defensively that the bucket had moved on its own. September came in gold and red and cooler, and the wheat harvest on Abraham's small fields was not the catastrophic failure he had feared or the tremendous success he had hoped for. But it was decent, a real crop that produced real income, and Abraham stood at the edge of his field on harvest day with his hands on his hips and a quiet satisfaction on his face that was better than elation because it was earned and real. Matilda was there for the harvest. She had come to the ranch that morning with a basket of bread and a pot of Mrs. Calloway's stew for the midday meal, and she and Mrs. Calloway's daughter, who had come from Wichita to help, set up the meal in the shade of the barn while Abraham and Charlie and two neighboring ranchers who had come to help worked the field with scythes and sweat. Charlie, it emerged over the course of the harvest day, had developed a profound and embarrassing admiration for Mrs. Calloway's daughter, whose name was Frances, which Matilda found quietly amusing for reasons she kept to herself. Frances was 22 and perfectly capable of managing Charlie Briggs's admiration with cheerful competence, and the two of them conducted a conversation over the midday meal that was largely about the harvest and entirely about each other, in the way that young people's conversations sometimes are. The solicitor in Wichita had responded to Matilda's letter. His name was Fowler, as Abraham had said, and his letter was detailed and clear. The will was valid. The land in Missouri was Matilda's by legal right, and Clement's claim had no foundation that was likely to survive a court proceeding. Fowler had suggested she could either pursue the matter formally, which would take time and some money, or she could wait and see whether Clement elected to proceed on his own, which Fowler considered unlikely given the weakness of his position. She had read the letter 3 times and then sat down at Mrs. Calloway's kitchen table and felt a kind of lightness that she had not expected, a physical sensation, as though something she had been carrying so long she had forgotten its weight had been gently set down. She wrote back to Fowler directing him to proceed with the formal resolution, because she wanted it finished and documented and not left half done. She told Abraham about the letter that evening. They were sitting on the porch of the boarding house after supper, a habit they had fallen into without discussing it, sharing the last hour of daylight in the particular quiet that late summer evenings produce on the prairie when the heat has finally relented. "It is good news," he said. "It is," she agreed. She was sitting on the porch step with her shoulders against the post, and he was in the chair beside her, and the evening star had appeared in the western sky, pale and steady above the dark horizon. "The land in Missouri is mine. I do not know what to do with it. I am not going back to Missouri." "You could sell it," he said. "I could." She looked at the evening star. "Or I could simply own it. It is not nothing to own a piece of land even if you never stand on it." "No," he agreed. "It is not nothing." She turned and looked at him in the fading light, this man with the brown gold eyes and the careful hands and the honest, unhurried way of being in the world. "Abraham," she said, "what are you thinking?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I am thinking that winter comes early out here, and that the house on my ranch has 2 small rooms and insufficient insulation in the north wall, and that I have been considering how to fix the insulation problem and also how to add a room, and that I find these are interconnected thoughts in my mind with another thought, which is that I would very much like to ask you to marry me." She looked at him steadily. "That was the least romantic proposal I have ever heard described." He almost smiled. "I know. I am not a man who does well with ornamentation. I am better with plain words." "Plain words are fine," she said. "Go ahead and use them." He did not quite smile, but his eyes changed, which with Abraham was the same thing. "Matilda," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without ornamentation of her own, because they were alike in that way, and she thought that this was perhaps one of the most important ways 2 people could be alike. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together on the porch of Mrs. Calloway's boarding house while the evening star brightened and the sky went dark, and the sounds of Caldwell at night rose and fell around them. And she thought that the name she had planned to change was now going to change in precisely the opposite way from what she had intended, and that this was not a compromise or a defeat, but was simply the way some things unfold when you are paying attention. They married in October. Mrs. Calloway organized the affair with the systematic efficiency she brought to everything, which meant it was neither small nor ostentatious, but exactly the right size for what it was. The ceremony was conducted by the circuit preacher, a lean man of 60 named Whitfield, who rode between Caldwell and 3 other towns, and had officiated at more frontier marriages than he could count. He performed the ceremony in the parlor of the boarding house, which had been cleared of its usual furniture, and filled with dried prairie grasses and late-blooming wildflowers that Eleanor Marsh had gathered from the fields east of town. Eleanor stood beside Matilda, and Charlie Briggs stood beside Abraham, and Charlie had washed his face for the occasion and was wearing a coat that was slightly too large for him, and had the look of a person who had made a genuine effort, which everyone appreciated. Frances Calloway had come from Wichita again, ostensibly to help her mother with the event, and she and Charlie managed to stand on the same side of the room for approximately 15 consecutive minutes, which was a record. Matilda wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that she had bought from the seamstress 2 weeks prior with money from her wages, and she had pinned her dark hair up with the ivory combs that had been her mother's, the one thing she had carried from St. Louis that was entirely her own and no one else's. She looked, Eleanor told her privately, like herself, which was the best thing Eleanor could think to say, and Matilda thought so too. Abraham wore his best coat, which was black wool and fit him well, and he had his hat clean and his boots polished, and he stood at the front of the room waiting for her, with an expression that was not the performed emotion of a man doing what is expected of him at his wedding, but was the genuine, contained, serious expression of a man who is about to have something he did not think he would have, and knows it. She walked to him across Mrs. Calloway's parlor with the dried grasses whispering against the ceiling beams, and the afternoon light coming through the lace curtains, and he took her hand and held it in both of his the way he had held it in the wheat field, and they said the words that Preacher Whitfield set before them. When it was done, Mrs. Calloway produced a cake that she had been making in secret for 3 days, a proper cake with dried fruit and a great deal of effort, and Garrett Hutchins, who had apparently decided that Abraham Hawkins was a man worth being friendly with, arrived with a bottle of whiskey that he shared generously. Charlie Briggs ate 4 pieces of cake and nobody commented on it because it seemed consistent with his general character. That evening, as the light went golden and the party dissolved into its various contentments, Eleanor Marsh found Matilda briefly alone by the window and said, "You did not change your name." "No," Matilda said. "I did not." She looked out the window at the street where Caldwell was going about its business with its usual lack of ceremony. "I thought I needed a different name to be a different person. It turned out I only needed to be in a different place." She paused, "and to meet the right person." Eleanor smiled. "Matilda Hawkins," she said, trying it. Matilda tried it in her own mind for a moment. "That is a different name," she said. "Is it a good one?" She looked across the room to where Abraham was talking to Preacher Whitfield with his characteristic attentiveness, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the party moving comfortably around him. "Yes," she said, "I think it is." They moved to the ranch in the 2nd week of October. The house was small and Abraham had been right about the north wall, but he had already begun the repair, and Charlie Briggs had been recruited into the project with great enthusiasm and variable skill. The additional room was framed by the time the first frost came, and Matilda hung curtains in the windows and put her mother's ivory combs on the small dresser in their room, and stood in the kitchen of her own house on the Kansas prairie and felt, for the first time in her adult life, that she was standing exactly where she had chosen to stand. She learned the particular rhythms of the ranch. The cattle required daily attention of a methodical kind that she found she could master with the same approach she brought to accounts, breaking the complexity into component parts and managing each one. Abraham taught her to ride properly, not the careful managed riding she had done in St. Louis, but the real kind, responsive and confident, and she took to it with a determination that pleased him and occasionally alarmed Charlie, who witnessed her early mistakes with the expression of someone watching a very competent person refuse to be deterred by failure. The wheat fields were dormant under the autumn skies, waiting for spring and a new planting season. Abraham had already decided on a slightly larger field for the coming year, encouraged by the first harvest, and he spent the evenings planning the expansion with the same careful, methodical attention he brought to everything. Matilda sat across the table from him working on the accounts or writing letters, and the lamp between them made a warm circle in the darkness, and the wind came off the prairie and tested the walls of the house, and the house held, which seemed like exactly the right thing for a house to do. Charlie Briggs took his meals with them 3 days a week, which had been the arrangement before the marriage and continued to be the arrangement after it, because Abraham was not a man who changed arrangements that were working, and because Matilda found Charlie's combination of earnestness and impractical optimism genuinely charming. He was growing up visibly, the freckles becoming somewhat less overwhelming relative to the face, and the enthusiasm being gradually organized by experience into something approaching competence. He was also writing letters to Frances Calloway in Wichita, which he did not mention to anyone, but which Abraham had noticed from the frequency with which Charlie inquired about the mail. Abraham said nothing about it to Charlie. He mentioned it to Matilda one evening with the quiet amusement of a man who is watching something unfold that he remembers understanding from the inside, and Matilda said that Frances was fully capable of managing her own correspondence, and that they ought to leave them to it, and Abraham agreed, and they left them to it. November came cold and emphatic, the way November comes on the Kansas plains, with a decisiveness that makes you understand immediately that winter is not a suggestion. The cattle were moved to the south field, where there was more shelter from the wind, and Abraham and Charlie reinforced the barn against the cold with bales of straw packed against the outer walls, and the house was stocked with supplies and firewood in the organized, thorough way that Abraham prepared for anything, which was to say nothing was left to chance, and everything was done before it needed to be done rather than at the moment when it became urgent. On a cold, gray November evening, Matilda told Abraham she was expecting a child. She told him simply and directly because that was how she told him everything, and she watched his face change in a way she had not seen his face change before, something that opened in it, some carefully maintained containment that had always been there giving way to something open and undefended, and his eyes went bright and he put down whatever he had been holding and he crossed the kitchen and he put his hands on her face and said her name. Just her name. Matilda. The same name she had stepped off the stagecoach with, the name she had meant to change, the name that a man with brown gold eyes and capable hands had told her suited her, the name she had kept. She put her hands over his. The fire was going in the hearth, and the wind was at the walls, and the prairie was dark and enormous in every direction beyond the small, warm, specific place where they stood. "Are you pleased?" she asked. "I am more than pleased," he said. "I did not know I could be this pleased." She laughed, and he held her face in his hands and looked at her the way he had looked at the wheat field on harvest day, with the careful, serious joy of a man who has worked for something real and arrived at it. The winter was long and cold and full of the particular intimacy that comes from two people confined to a small space by weather and circumstance, and finding that they do not run out of things to say to each other. They talked, the kind of talking that is not performance or obligation but exploration, the slow mapping of another person's interior. She told him things she had not told Eleanor or Mrs. Calloway or anyone. He told her things that she understood he had carried without voice for a long time, about the cattle drive years and the loneliness of them, and the beauty of the land at dawn, and the way you could ride all day and feel like the only person in the world, and whether that was freedom or just solitude dressed up as freedom, and how you eventually wanted to know the difference. She read to him in the evenings, which was something he liked but which he had not had anyone to do for him in years. She had brought books from St. Louis, a worn copy of Dickens, and a volume of poetry that she was sometimes embarrassed to admit she had and sometimes read aloud from anyway, and he listened with his eyes half closed in the firelight with the expression of a man receiving something he had not known to ask for. He taught her to play cards, which she took to with the same focused competence she brought to arithmetic, and she beat him so consistently after the first 2 weeks that he had to examine his own teaching to determine whether he had unwittingly given her too thorough an education. She was, he concluded, simply very good at reading patterns and acting on information, which made her dangerous at cards and excellent at almost everything else that mattered. Charlie Briggs came by on horseback through the winter, less frequently than in fair weather but regularly enough, and he always brought news from Caldwell and took back letters that needed posting, which was a practical arrangement that suited everyone. He mentioned Francis Calloway in his third sentence approximately every visit, framing the mention as incidental when it was clearly central, and Abraham and Matilda exchanged glances across the table that they both pretended not to notice. In March, a letter arrived from Fowler, the solicitor in Wichita. The legal matter of the Missouri land had been resolved. Clement Redmond's claim had been formally dismissed. The 40 acres along the creek were unambiguously Matilda's. She sat with the letter for a long time, reading it twice, and then she folded it and put it in the cedar box where she kept important papers, next to the copy of the will and her marriage certificate, and she went to find Abraham, who was in the barn assessing the condition of the fencing wire that had survived the winter. "It is finished," she said. He straightened up and looked at her. "All of it, all of it. The land is mine. Clement has no claim." "Fowler says it is fully and finally resolved." Abraham nodded slowly. He came toward her across the barn floor, past the horses who shifted in their stalls and looked at them with the patient, incurious eyes of horses who have seen everything. He put his arms around her, which he did not do as a performance of comfort because he knew she did not need comforting about this, but as a recognition of completion, the way you might put your hand on the finished frame of a new room and feel that it is sound. "What will you do with the land?" he asked into her hair. "Sell it," she said. "I have decided. I want nothing tying me back there. I want the money from it to go into the ranch, into this." She pulled back and looked up at him. "This is where I live. This is what I am building. I do not need a piece of land in Missouri to have something of my own." He looked at her for a moment with the serious, warm attention she had come to know as his particular way of loving her, the paying attention itself being the love. "All right," he said. "I will write to Fowler about finding a buyer." "Already done," she said. "I wrote to him this morning." He looked at her, and then he smiled, the slow smile that started at the corners, and she thought that she would never tire of that smile as long as she lived. "Of course you did," he said. Spring came to the Kansas plains in the particular way it comes there, which is not gently, with soft rains and gradual warmth, but decisively, with wind and sudden green, and the sense of enormous things beginning all at once. The wheat went into the expanded fields in late April, more than twice the acreage of the year before, and Charlie Briggs worked beside Abraham from sunup to sundown, with an energy that had been refining itself all winter into something more disciplined and confident. Charlie was 18 in April. Abraham gave him a small raise and the formal title of head hand, which was a title rather than a new position, but which Charlie received with the seriousness of a commission, standing a little taller and doing nothing differently except with slightly more conscious intention. Matilda gave him a new work shirt that she had made over the winter, fitted properly to his actual dimensions rather than the charitable dimensions of the too-large coat, and he thanked her with such genuine feeling that she had to go into the kitchen for a moment. Eleanor Marsh came to visit in May, riding out from Caldwell on a Sunday afternoon with a basket of books and the kind of brightness in her face that suggested she had something to say beyond hello. She had been corresponding. She told them over tea in the small parlor that Matilda had made of what had been the storage room, with a man in Ohio who had been the brother of one of her colleagues at the school in Caldwell. She did not say anything further, but her eyes said quite a lot. Matilda was glad for Eleanor, and she said so plainly, and Eleanor blushed in the particular way of someone who is happy but not entirely ready to name the happiness yet, and Matilda understood that completely. The baby came in the last week of June, a boy, born on a hot, still morning when the prairie was bright with summer and the wheat was chest-high in the fields. The birth was attended by Mrs. Calloway, who had more practical experience of such matters than the doctor in Caldwell and considerably more personal investment in the outcome, and Abraham, who had insisted on being present and who was allowed to be, and who stood at the edge of the room through the difficult hours, with the expression of a man maintaining composed attention over something that is requiring every resource he has. When it was done and the baby was here, real and solid and extremely vocal about his arrival, Abraham came and sat beside Matilda on the bed and took her hand, and she looked at his face, which had come undone in the way she had seen on the November evening when she told him, the contained, careful man entirely given way to the man underneath, and she thought that she had been right to come west, right to stay, right to keep her name, right about all of it. "He is healthy," she managed. She was very tired. "He is," Mrs. Calloway said, with professional satisfaction. "He is a fine, healthy boy, and he has an opinion about it." He did. He was expressing that opinion at considerable volume. "Abraham," Matilda said. He looked at her. "I would like to name him James," she said, "after no one, just because I like it." Abraham looked at the boy, who was red-faced and furious with the general situation and had a quantity of dark hair that seemed implausible for someone only minutes old. "James Hawkins," he said, trying it. "Yes," she said. "It suits him," he said. She laughed very softly because she was too tired for more than that. "It does." James Hawkins grew. in the way that healthy, vigorous children on the frontier grew, which was to say quickly and noisily, and with a great deal of apparent enthusiasm for getting into everything that could possibly cause a problem. He had Abraham's eyes, the brown gold impossible to categorize color, and Matilda's dark hair, and a temperament that seemed to combine Abraham's careful observation with Matilda's absolute refusal to be deterred, which was a combination that suggested an interesting future. Charlie Briggs appointed himself James's informal protector from the moment the child could walk, which manifested primarily in Charlie walking 2 steps behind James at all times with his arms slightly out to the sides in case of falls, which Matilda found both touching and mildly exhausting to watch. The ranch grew. The wheat harvest in the fall of the baby's birth year was significantly better than the previous year, large enough to make a real difference in the accounts, and Abraham reinvested a portion of it in additional cattle and a new section of fencing that extended the grazing land north to the property line. Matilda managed the accounts with the precision she brought to everything, and the books were clean and clear, and showed a steady upward movement that was not spectacular but was real and honest, and honesty in accounts was something she valued above everything. The money from the sale of the Missouri land came through in the early autumn, transferred to Fowler, who sent it on to them, and it was more than she had expected, the Creek property having found a buyer who wanted it for reasons she did not inquire into and paid a fair price without argument. She and Abraham sat at the kitchen table with the figure on a piece of paper between them, and they were quiet for a moment with the particular quality of people who have been working very hard for something and have arrived at a moment of arrival. "What do we do with it?" he asked. "Some of it goes to expand the barn," she said. "You have been managing with less space than you need for 3 seasons. And some of it goes to the north field, which you have been wanting to fence for 2 years. And some of it goes into the bank and stays there, because a family with a growing child and a growing farm needs a reserve, and I do not want to be without one." He looked at the figure and then at her. "And the rest," she had been thinking about this. "There is a school in Caldwell," she said. "Eleanor tells me it is underfunded and that the building is inadequate. I would like to give some to that." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said simply. She made the donation through Eleanor quietly, without attaching her name to it publicly, because that was not the kind of thing she did for recognition. Eleanor knew and Abraham knew, and that was sufficient. Eleanor herself married the man from Ohio in the spring of the following year, a schoolteacher like herself named Robert Connell, who was quietly pleasant and clearly devoted, and who arrived in Caldwell with the sensible intention of starting a school there of his own, which suited the town well because it was growing. Eleanor wrote to Matilda about the wedding in a letter that was 3 pages of detail and unmistakable happiness, and Matilda read it aloud to Abraham at breakfast, and they were both genuinely glad. Charlie Briggs, who was now 19 and considerably more coordinated than he had been at 17, rode to Wichita in the spring to see a land exhibition that Abraham had suggested might be educational. He returned from Wichita 4 days later with information about the land exhibition, and also with Francis Calloway sitting behind him on his horse, which was an entirely predictable development that nevertheless caused Matilda to stand in the yard and press her hand over her mouth to contain her expression for a moment. Frances explained that she had decided to move back to Caldwell to help her mother in the boarding house, which was true enough, and that Charlie had offered to bring her on the ride back, which was also true, and that the horse had been perfectly comfortable for 2 people for 40 miles, which was not entirely true but which nobody contradicted. Mrs. Calloway received her daughter with the expression of a woman who had seen this coming for 2 years, and was simply pleased the process was complete. Charlie and Frances were married the following October, 2 years after Abraham and Matilda, in the same parlor of the boarding house with many of the same people and the same circuit preacher, who looked at Caldwell's continued production of marriages with philosophical acceptance. Abraham stood with Charlie and Matilda stood with Francis and James Hawkins, now 14 months old and newly walking with the aggressive confidence of a child who has recently discovered locomotion, spent the ceremony trying to reach the dried prairie grasses that decorated the windowsills and being gently redirected by everyone within reach. Abraham and Matilda rode home from the wedding in the cool October evening with James asleep between them on the wagon seat, his dark head against Matilda's side, and the prairie spread out enormous and dark in every direction under a sky extravagant with stars. Kansas stars in October are not modest. They filled the entire arch of the sky, the Milky Way a great river of light from horizon to horizon, and the horses moved quietly in the wagon traces, and the wheels turned on the familiar road. "Charlie will be all right," Abraham said, which was not a question but something between a statement and a private settlement of a concern. "He will," Matilda agreed. "Francis is practical enough for both of them and he is willing enough to learn. They will do well." Abraham nodded. They were quiet for a while with the horses and the stars and the sleeping child between them. "Matilda," he said, "yes, are you happy?" She had been asked this before in her life by people who asked it as a social inquiry, a courtesy, something that required the answer yes regardless of its accuracy. Abraham asked it the way he asked everything, with the genuine intention of receiving an accurate answer. She thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. She thought about the stagecoach and the first morning and the wind with teeth. She thought about the name she had planned to leave behind, and the man who had said it suited her, and the way something had shifted in her at those words and never quite shifted back. She thought about James asleep against her side, and the ranch with the lamplight in the window, and the wheat fields that stretched green every spring farther than the year before. "Yes," she said. It was not the yes of compliance or performance, but the yes of someone who has examined the question thoroughly and found the answer standing solid beneath examination. "I am very happy." He reached across the sleeping child and took her hand, the way he had taken it in the wheat field and on the porch and in 100 small moments since, and held it in both of his with the same careful, intentional quality. The horses walked on. The stars burned overhead. The prairie went wide and dark, and full of its own vast life all around them, the grasses whispering in the night wind, the distant sound of cattle somewhere in the dark, and the road home steady under the wheels. The following spring brought a wet season that was good for the wheat and difficult for the roads, and the ranch's expanded fields produced the best harvest yet, enough to require Abraham to hire an additional hand for the season. He found a man in Caldwell, a quiet, steady person named Marcus Webb who had come up from Texas on one of the drives and had decided against the return journey, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of practical, competent worker that a growing operation needed. Marcus was 42 and came without drama or difficulty, and he and Charlie worked well together, the experience of one complementing the enthusiasm of the other. Matilda began keeping the accounts for 2 other small ranches in the area, neighbors who had seen the quality of the books she kept, and asked whether she might do the same for them. She charged a fair rate and did the work with the same precision she brought to everything, and it provided an income that was independently hers, separate from the ranch's accounts, which mattered to her in a way she understood clearly and did not feel the need to justify. A woman who controlled her own financial standing was a woman who had genuine choices, and choices were the things she had come west to have. Abraham understood this without requiring explanation. He had always understood it from the first, from the way he had never attached conditions to his help or his affection, never made her feel that dependency was what he wanted from her. She had understood him by this, by what he did not want as much as by what he did. James, at 2 years old, was a small person of extreme views and remarkable vocabulary, who had decided that he was interested in the horses above all other things on the ranch, and who spent considerable time standing at the paddock fence regarding them, with an expression of concentrated ambition that was purely his father's expression on a face that was purely his mother's. Abraham began putting him up on the oldest and gentlest horse, a broad-backed bay mare named Louise, with Abraham's hand at the back of the saddle, and James rode with the absolute composure of a person who has always known this was what they were supposed to be doing. "He is going to be a horseman," Abraham said one afternoon, watching James pat Louise's neck with the proprietary confidence of a 2-year-old who has made a major life decision. "He is already telling Louise what to do," Matilda observed. "Louise does not seem to mind," Abraham said. Louise did not. Louise was the kind of horse that understood children intuitively and managed them with the patient authority of a very experienced nanny, which endeared her permanently to Matilda. The second pregnancy Matilda told Abraham about in the late summer of the year James turned 2, and this time she told him in the morning at the kitchen table over coffee, and he put his cup down and he looked at her with the same open, undefended expression as the first time, and he said, "Matilda," just her name, in exactly the same tone, and she thought that she would never get tired of hearing him say it. This child was born in the early spring, a girl, small and dark-haired and immediately opinionated about everything, and they named her Ruth, after nobody in particular, simply because it was a name with some weight to it, some history, which was the criterion Matilda now applied to names with an awareness of where that criterion had come from. James's reaction to Ruth was immediate and proprietorial. He regarded her with the same concentrated assessment he brought to the horses and decided within the first hour that she was his responsibility, a conclusion he communicated to everyone in the household with great seriousness, and which he backed up by bringing her objects he considered interesting and sitting beside her with the self-appointed gravity of a person who has taken on an important duty. Mrs. Calloway came to help with Ruth's first weeks, as she had with James, and she sat in the kitchen in the evenings when the children were sleeping, and she and Matilda talked in the comfortable way of women who have worked together and know each other well. "Mrs. Calloway said, looking around the small but warm kitchen with its curtains and its proper accounts ledger on the shelf and the children's things arranged on the side table, "You have made a good place here, Matilda." "I have had help," Matilda said. "You have used the help well," Mrs. Calloway said, which was the more precise and accurate thing to say, and was exactly the kind of thing Mrs. Calloway would say because she was exact and accurate. Charlie and Frances had their own news by then, Frances expecting their first child in the summer, and Charlie walked around Caldwell and the ranch with the expression of a man who cannot quite contain what he is feeling and does not particularly try to, which Matilda found endearing in a way she did not tell him because he would have been embarrassed. The ranch had become, by the 3rd year of their marriage, a genuinely productive operation. The wheat fields were established and reliable. The cattle herd had grown to a respectable size. Marcus Webb had become a permanent hired hand rather than seasonal, and Charlie, who was technically hired help and practically something between a foreman and a younger brother to Abraham, made the whole thing run with a consistency that freed Abraham to think about the larger questions of direction and expansion, rather than only the immediate demands of daily operation. Matilda's accounting work had expanded to 4 neighboring ranches plus her own, and she had been asked by Garrett Hutchins, who had finally made peace with the fact that she was both competent and permanent, whether she would consider taking on the general store's accounts as well. She considered it and said yes, with a rate that Garrett initially contested and then accepted, because she had arrived at it with specific numbers and showed him the reasoning, which was a method of argument he recognized as effective from previous experience. She was building something of her own that was entirely separate from being Abraham's wife and the children's mother, and she was not conflicted about this because she had learned, in the years since Caldwell and the stagecoach and the wind with teeth, that the different parts of a person do not need to compete. She was Matilda Hawkins, who had been Matilda Redmond, who had once been Matilda Carroll, and all of those names and all of those selves were still there, and the accumulation of them was not a confusion but a history, and she had come to value the history. Abraham said, one evening in the summer of their 4th year, watching the children play in the yard in the long gold light, James chasing a dog of uncertain ancestry that had arrived at the ranch 6 months prior and elected to stay, and Ruth sitting with deliberate concentration trying to weave grass stems together. I did not know it could be like this. She was sitting beside him on the porch step, and she looked at him. "What do you mean?" "When I bought this land," he said, "I thought I was building towards something. I did not know what the something was. I had the land and the work and the idea of a future, but the future was not specific. It was just the direction you go when you are moving away from the wrong things." He looked at the children, and at the fields beyond them, and at the sky that was the great, enormous Kansas sky doing what it did in summer, filling itself with light. I did not know the specific was going to be this. She looked at what he was looking at. The children in the yard, the dog, the wheat fields green and orderly in the distance, the solid walls of the house that they had worked together and independently to make into something that held, and the evening coming in from the west with its colors, pink and gold, and the particular deep blue that came before dark. "I came out here meaning to change everything," she said, for the 100th time, but with the weight that the statement still carried. "My name and my life and my whole shape. And I changed some things and kept others, and had things change me that I had not planned on. And this is what came of it." She put her hand over his on the porch railing, and he turned his palm up and held it the way he always held it, with both hands, the way you hold something you intend to keep. "The name suited you," he said. "You told me that the 2nd week I was here." "I know," he said. "I was right," she laughed. "You were, insufferably." "I did not say it to be right," he said. "I said it because it was true." "I know," she said, and leaned against his shoulder, and they watched the children in the yard in the evening light, James having caught the dog and now dragging it in a direction the dog did not endorse but was tolerating with good nature, and Ruth successfully completing her grass stem weaving, and holding it up for inspection with the expression of a person who has accomplished exactly what they set out to accomplish and knew they would. The sun went down over the Kansas plain in the way the Kansas sun goes down, with no modesty and no apology, the whole sky turning colors that had no name sufficient to them, red and gold and orange and the particular pink of the very last light before dark. And then the stars came out one by one, and then all at once, and the prairie went quiet in the way it went quiet at night, which was not the quiet of absence but the quiet of enormous presence. The land simply being what it was in the dark. James came in from the yard with grass in his hair and the dog following him uninvited, and he said, with the authority of a 4-year-old who has decided something, "The dog's name is Bucket." "Because you have been spending too much time with Charlie Briggs," Matilda said. "It is a good name," James said with complete conviction. Abraham looked at Matilda. "It is a name with some weight to it," she said, keeping her face perfectly straight. "Some history," Abraham agreed. James looked between them, sensing that something was being said that he did not entirely follow, which was a feeling he would grow accustomed to over the coming years, and which would eventually make him very patient with the things adults found funny that had nothing to do with anything visible. He decided to accept the agreement and went inside with the dog, who had now become Bucket in all legal and moral senses. Ruth had fallen asleep in the yard, still holding her grass weaving, and Abraham went and picked her up with the careful tenderness he brought to her that was the same quality he brought to everything he cared about, the attentiveness that was itself the love. He carried her inside, her dark head against his shoulder, her grass weaving still clutched in one small fist. Matilda stood on the porch for a moment alone in the evening air, looking out at the dark prairie and the stars above it, and the lights of the distant town that was Caldwell, which was still loud and dusty, and nothing like she had expected, which had turned out to be the best possible version of itself. She thought about the stagecoach and the $43, and the name she had been carrying west, and the man who had nearly knocked her case into the mud, and then told her the name suited her. She thought about all the things she had intended to change, and all the things that had changed her instead, and the way those two kinds of change had woven themselves together into something she could not have designed but could recognize now as exactly right. She was Matilda Hawkins. She had been Matilda Redmond. The name Matilda had survived every version of her life and every attempt to replace it, not because she had failed to change, but because it had turned out to be exactly hers after all. She went inside, where Abraham was putting Ruth into her bed, and James was explaining to Bucket that dogs slept on the floor, and the lamp was burning warm on the kitchen table, and the accounts ledger was on the shelf where it belonged, and outside the prairie was doing what it had always done, enormous and dark and full of stars and wind, and the particular, unnameable wildness that she had not had a word for on the morning she arrived, and now understood was simply freedom. Which was the thing she had come west to find and had found, in all the ways she had planned and all the ways she had not. She sat at the kitchen table and opened the accounts ledger to record the day's figures, which was the last task she always did before the lamp went out, and Abraham came and stood behind her chair for a moment with his hand on her shoulder, the weight of it familiar and specific in his, and he said good night to the room in general and went down the hall. She finished the last column and balanced the figures and found they were correct, as she had known they would be, and she closed the ledger and put it on the shelf and blew out the lamp, and the kitchen went dark except for the starlight through the window, which on a clear Kansas night was enough light to see by, just barely, just enough. She stood at the window for a moment in the dark and the starlight, looking out at the prairie, and she thought, here it is, the rest of my life. She had thought that on the morning she arrived, standing in the main street with the wind in her face and her traveling case in her hand, and she had been right, and she had not known then how right she was, or how good the rest of her life was going to be, or how the name she had planned to leave behind was going to be the one thing that stayed constant through all the changing, the one true thing she had brought west that was entirely and completely her own. She went to bed in the house she had helped build on the land she had chosen, beside the man who had seen her clearly from the beginning, and the prairie stretched out in every direction in the dark, and the stars were beyond counting, and the wind came off the plain steady and warm and alive with the smell of summer grass, and Matilda Hawkins, who had once been Matilda Redmond, who had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878 with $43 and a name she intended to change, went to sleep in the middle of the life she had made, and it was exactly enough, and it was exactly hers, and she would not have changed a single thing.